Anybody that's been on a Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things, namely Skinwalkers. I've only seen one. Here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo res, and we usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. It hadn't been long, about 2 hours of driving, before we had entered the reservation. And by this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles an hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only its face seemed to be painted half black and half white, and its eyes seemed to be glowing like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, holy shit, it's a Skinwalker. It ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring directly at me. After I made eye contact with it, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The Skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked yellow pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the whole ordeal. The Skinwalker started to crumple down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over its body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert and out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and vomited. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy, and I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief and get a blessing. I saw him the next day. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing, turned around, got back in his truck, and drove off. To this day, I haven't seen another Skinwalker. It might be due to the fact that I moved away from that town and reservation, and if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around. I heard this from a friend of mine. This was in a small town in Oklahoma with a decent-sized native population. Anyway, this guy is actually Mexican. Nicest dude you would ever want to meet. He was about 35 at the time. He was driving back to the US after visiting family in Mexico. His wife was in the passenger seat asleep. He wasn't too far from the border, so he decided to keep driving a little after midnight instead of stopping somewhere for the night. It was sort of a desert-type road. He says he was going about 65 miles an hour when he noticed something in his peripheral vision outside the passenger window. Something was out there, and it was keeping up with him. Obviously, this shook him up. He hit the gas, 70, 75, 80, 85. It was still keeping up. At this point, It was almost too absurd that he thought it was just his tiredness playing tricks on his eyes. Until it changed directions. Instead of moving parallel with his car, it began to angle back toward the road in a manner to intercept the vehicle. As it got closer, more light hit it, and he said, in no uncertain terms, that it looked like a human. It was still slightly shadowed from the darkness, but he was certain it was humanoid form. He accelerated to 90 miles per hour, and a few seconds later, it angled back into the darkness and was gone. As he finished his story, his eyes were welled up, and his hands were trembling. And this was a tough, no BS dude. It physically struck him to the core just to recall it. Not surprisingly, he said he's never going back to Mexico. I'm Navajo, and boy, have I heard a lot of stories growing up on the reservation. While I've never actually seen anything myself, which I'm grateful for, I've benefited by being around the people who have. There is a different kind of evil that exists in the quiet high deserts and deep sandstone canyons of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. I can only describe it as an ancient evil. Now, there are helpful ceremonies, rituals, and traditions that are still practiced to this day. Hell, even a local hospital has an on-duty medicine man, but it seems to be a double-edged sword. What I mean is, there's also black magic, which most Navajo will not even acknowledge or speak of. We are very superstitious and are heavy with taboos. You'll find this with most First Nation people. From Alaska to Argentina, it's just something you don't do, in fear that it will get the attention of unwanted spirits or harmful beings. Skinwalkers, or Naladushi, are just a few stories that kept me up at night with the covers over my head. Here's a quick one for you guys. A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lightly snowing, maybe a quarter of an inch, which is a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there, or where she was going, was not apparent, because she was so far out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right away, but as he passes, he noticed she's dressed in traditional clothing. A shawl, dress, moccasins, and her hair in the traditional bun. Not too odd, many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather this late at night? Hitchhiking, maybe. He passed her too quickly and now has to turn around, and as he makes a U-turn, he notices that she's nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he's sure he saw an old woman walking. He pulls the squad car over and steps out with a flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He follows the footprints until they suddenly turn into what look like dog paw prints, leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He's a little shaken up, but asks the other officer if he's ever seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right Good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving those wide open spaces at night, and I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, but I never pick them up at night. It was a Wednesday night at my college, and me and some friends were bored, so we decided to take a trip from our school to Foxwoods Casino in Connecticut. If you've ever been there, you'll know that Foxwoods is on an Indian reservation in what can accurately be described as the middle of nowhere. There is absolutely nothing around besides the casino, save some old houses. We got to the casino around 10 p.m., 3 girls and 2 guys, and played some blackjack. Around 2 a.m., we call it quits and decide to head back to campus, which is about a 2-hour drive. The fog was really bad that night. New England fog is the worst. Then it starts to rain, and driving in that was no fun. I'm driving, my boy's in the passenger seat, and the 3 girls are in the back. The girls, being girls, start to comment on how dark and dreary it was outside. Also, they start to play at the Native American spiritual aspect of where we were, getting themselves all worked up. Me and my boy in the front thought it was funny, more concerned with how we were going to spend the money we just won in blackjack. My old GPS usually said to get on a main road, and main road in Connecticut means a road with some buildings near it, right away. But I was using a new one, and it said to take a different route. And I was curious if there was a faster way back to the main highway, so I followed the new path. As I was making a left turn, the girls all screamed at once. I wonder what's up, and I noticed what we're turning into. Even for Nowheresville, this road was scary. There were no houses, just woods on either side, and although the road was paved, it was not well developed. Still, my GPS said we were on it for only 1 mile before we got on the highway, so I told the girls to relax. It was tough to see through the rain and fog, so I had to go slow. This wasn't fun. I noticed that there was a creepy pond to our right, and we could hear noises in the woods around us. My boy told them it was just some Connecticut deer, but they were all starting to get actually scared, not just playing around. And honestly, so did I. I realized that if my car were ever to break down in this scary of a place, I was going to shit myself. But my GPS said 0.2 miles and we were out of there. And then, that's when the girl screamed again. I looked up. All of a sudden, the road ended and the woods began. This wasn't just some construction or something. The road just came to an end. The trees and such just started, and there was nowhere else to go but back. At this point, I got really frightened. There were no houses or light posts around, just blackness besides my headlights. Now, I needed to make a complete 180 to turn around and go all the way back. And I turned my head around to look through my back windshield to make sure I wasn't hitting anything. And I saw the girls' faces start to quiver. I knew they were ready to scream again, but I didn't know what about. I turned around, and at the end of the road staring back at us was a dog. A skinny, brown-colored dog of decent overall size. It was sitting right in front of us, no more than 10 feet away. And although the fog and rain were bad, we could see it clearly with my headlights on. And then, I noticed it moving, but not toward us. It hopped up on its back legs and stood upright in a very human way. At this point, everyone was silent, and I knew I couldn't just kick it in reverse because there was a nearby pond, and I didn't want to drive into it. I thought about running it over. I mean, I love animals, trust me, but if you were ever in this situation, you would think about it too. The dog didn't get back on all fours. Instead, it continued to stare. A blank, dark stare right at us. I watched as it moved its front paws toward each other, slowly. And then, it began to clap. I swear to God, it just stood there and clapped. Slowly, staring at us. Finally, to cap off the creepiness, it sported this deranged smile, as if it was the end for us, in more than one way. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head around, put the car in reverse, and did a 180. I sped my way out of there as fast as I could drive, until we hit the main road. The ride all the way back to school was nerve-wracking. I have never felt so relieved to be back in my dorm. And needless to say, I'll never go back to Foxwoods. Never again. In 1970, I was serving as a corporal in the U.S. Army, and deployed to South Vietnam in a region about 30 miles south of the DMZ. At the time, I was second in command of a squad of soldiers. We had set up a biovac in a jungle area that had a few steep hills. That evening, my section was ordered to patrol one of the small valleys west of the encampment. We moved out, led by our sergeant. Not long after entering one of the small valleys, we detected movement ahead of us. It seemed to be scattered activity, so we doubted it was VC, but we weren't positive. We hunkered down for about 15 minutes, getting occasional glimpses of something moving within the trees and brush. There wasn't enough light to detect what we were observing, even though the moonlight was pretty bright that night. After a while, the activity halted, so we continued to move slowly through the valley. As we approached a sheer wall on the hill, it looked like someone, or something, had stacked large stones and boulders in the pass in front of us. There was also an opening in the hillside that looked like a cave entrance, approximately 5 foot high and 3 foot wide, narrowing at the top. When observing the passageway, it appeared to have been cut away by machinery. The edges were smooth, with small, even-spaced grooves. We were puzzled because we had never seen enemy caves like this, just underground tunnels. The sergeant suggested that it may be a VC supply depot, so we started to assess how we were going to investigate the cave. About this time, things got very strange. We began to notice a putrid odor emanating from the cave entrance. The only thing I can compare it to was rotting eggs and human decay. It was so revolting that a few of the soldiers were becoming ill and started to back away into the jungle, including the sergeant. I was directing a light into the entrance in order to observe or anything, but there was a haze that was impossible to see through. We had no idea what was before us. The entire squad took a position in the heavy brush, approximately 150 feet from the entrance, far enough not to be detected, but close enough to observe the cave entrance. We quietly remained there for what seemed like forever. The jungle was strangely calm, even though we heard rumbling sounds coming from the distance. It was really eerie. The sergeant was sitting near me talking to himself. It was obvious that he was frightened. I was looking at the rest of the squad. Each had wide eyes and was scanning the area. No one was going to doze off during this patrol. After several hours, dawn was approaching and it started to lighten up. I checked my watch. It was just before 5 a.m. Just then, we noticed movement in the front of the cave. A being, I first thought it was a man, moved through the entrance into the clearing in front of the cave. As it stood up from a crouch, it stood at least 7 feet high, and it started to look in our direction. At that time, another similar looking creature was moving out of the cave. They were making these hellish hissing sounds and looking directly at us. The only way I can describe these beings is that they look like upright lizards. Their scaly, shiny skin was very dark, almost black. Snake-like faces with forward-set eyes that were very large. They had arms and legs like a human, but with scales. I didn't notice any tails, though they wore long, one-piece dark green robes, along with a dark cap-like covering on their heads. I never noticed if they had anything on their feet. No one gave the order. It seemed like the entire squad opened fire at once. Every piece of vegetation between us and them was quickly sheared away. I yelled out a ceasefire order. At the same time, I was looking in the direction of the cave. There was nothing there. We immediately checked our flank in case they had circled around us, but there was nothing. As we approached the cave, ready to resume action if needed, it became apparent that the beings had escaped, most likely back into the cave. It was soon decided to set charges and close the cave entrance. When we returned to camp, we all seemed to be in a daze. There was little discussion of the incident, and we were never debriefed, so I know the sergeant never filed a report.